speaker today. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Luke McCauley from the University of Maryland. He's going to talk about deer control.
Great, thank you very much, Ben. Thanks everybody for being here. This is my first time to Garrett and staying in this hotel. And last night I went down to get food, see what's going on in the lobby. And I walked in, and I didn't know if anybody's aware, but there's like the largest country line dancing scene in 300 miles happening here. Every Thursday night, it's like a big night. So it was like a different world. All of a sudden, there was like 100 people there line dancing. I was like, in Holiday Inn. Yeah, it's been going on here for 50 years apparently. So super cool. So next time I'm here, I'm going to make sure to swing by. It was a good time. Somebody brought me out on the dance floor, got to do some line dancing. So, thanks. So we're here to talk about deer damage, and the title. I think this title is a little bit more appropriate. I like to talk about the 4 main things that you can use to deal with deer damage. Now, many of you, if you've been dealing with deer damage a long time, you're going to know a lot of this stuff. But maybe there's going to be something new in here, some different tricks and tools that I've been working on and others have learned about. As I give these talks, I hear from people. We can go to sort of share different techniques. So there's 4 main things, but I like to get started by just going through the problem. Let's see if I can advance my slides here. There we go. So here's a farm in Delaware. And I'll start by saying the Maryland Soybean Board and the Delaware Soybean Board have been instrumental in funding this research and getting a lot of this stuff going. So thanks to them, and also a lot of colleagues who helped make this possible. So this is a farm in Delaware near Harrington. 35 acres about in this patch here. You can see his home site, and you might be able to see a lot of this sort of brown area. And he is 40-acre farm and about 1,000 acres of woods. So you can imagine the deer pressure is pretty intense here. I like to start my presentation by sort of showing this little green dot right there. You might not be able to see it. There's a little green dot in the field. If you zoom in, this is what it looks like. You might be wondering what is that? Are there aliens out there making crop circles or something? And no, it's just a deer exposure fence, just to see what's possible in that spot. And what it looks like. This just shows the sort of catastrophic damage that this farmer, Joe Street, has. I'd like to give a little bit about deer biology and behavior, help us think about how these things happen and why. So deer will eat about 6 to 8% of their body weight daily, and that's wet weight. So that translates to 9 to 12 pounds of green forage daily. We'll see a picture of about that amount of forage. Here's a picture of Dr. Steve Damaris out of Mississippi State showing sort of what that looks like. It's on a table. And I actually have a picture we're going to show. It's probably about 8-10 pounds as well later on of actual forage. And that's for a 150-pound deer. So if it's a 200-pound deer, it's a big deer, it's going to be eating even more. Something that people might not think about, if you're in the livestock industry, you're probably familiar with this, or if you ever raised cattle with calves, this is the sort of energy chart for a deer's need throughout the year. And the brown at the bottom is the sort of baseline maintenance energy. Like you need 2,000 calories a day just to survive and live. Once this stuff on top is the contribution of pregnancy in red. So when that doe has a fawn in her belly, her energetic needs are increasing. And then this blue line is when she drops her fawn. And you think, okay, the fawn's out, the deer's nutritional needs are going to go down. No, they actually continue to peak at the peak of like lactation a few weeks, even maybe a month later. And that sort of energetic need coincides with the time when people are planting their soybeans. So the other compounding issue with deer damage, and again, you've probably seen this or dealt with this. This is a chart looking at our deer activity over the course of a summer. We used about, in this case, 10 trail cameras out on soybean field. And every time there was a deer picture, we just noted how many pictures there were in our soybean field. So the height of these bars is the number of pictures we saw of deer in the field. The gold part of it is deer during the day, and the blue part of it is deer during the night. And so you have this sort of early June, there wasn't a whole lot of activity, but you have these huge spikes of activity that happen every week, 10 days. You'll have these sort of huge grazing events that can be very difficult to predict and to be able to manage. It's like if you knew when they were going to be there, you could maybe do something about it. But it's quite random, it seems, and it can be kind of catastrophic all at once. And this is something that kind of surprised me when I saw it. And then a further challenge is that a lot of this is happening at night when you can't see them, and at least in Maryland, you can't hunt them without special permits that are quite difficult to get. So in these big spikes, we found these 5 days of these big spikes accounted for about 45% of the deer grazing on these plots, which was pretty interesting for me to see that kind of intensity of grazing in short periods of time. And 64% of it occurred after legal shooting hours. So if you're only using hunting seasons, those deer learn how to be nocturnal. These weren't highly pressured deer. This is in the summer. The hunting season is not open, so they're already pretty nocturnal even before hunting season. And I know in a lot of cases they'll go even more nocturnal as soon as the hunting season starts. So that's our problem. That's sort of some biology. That's what we see how deer operate. Now we'll talk about management. Now these are the 4 pillars. These have been developed for decades and been talked about by deer folks for a long time. But the 4 main ones are habitat and vegetation changes to try to manipulate where deer are going to go. The second is fencing. Third is repellents, and the last is lethal control or hunting options. So we'll start with this sort of habitat and vegetation tool. So we've been experimenting for about 3 years now with using buffers around a field that are planted in a forage soybean to try to keep the deer damage to that strip on the outside of the field. This is an example. This is a cornfield that was planted, I believe, with 2 rows of forage soybeans on the outside. And the farmer, you can see this is dirt now. And the farmer said, we're like, wow, are these forage soybeans really doing much? He's like, well, I'll tell you, Luke, this is gonna be really hard to prove in a scientific study, but I can tell you I'm a penny pincher more than anybody. And I know that this is working, and I will plant this again because it's helping. So he could just tell by looking at his field, his crops look better than they did with this buffer around it. Even though it was sort of a loss, at least the rest of his fields weren't as badly damaged. So we put out various approaches to using these are trail cameras in a long row. We've tried different approaches to try to quantify deer activity and see are deer preferring certain varieties over others. Here's a picture of some of our forage soybeans. You can see all these leaves at the top just grazed off. And this is right after planting in the spring. We have these rows of soybeans coming up. So forage soybeans, if you don't know what they are, they're actually soybeans were first brought to the US for forage for livestock back in the 1890s. It wasn't until World War II when they started being grown more for the bean than for the forage. And now there's some interest also. They're still being used in dairy operations sometimes for forage, but we tried a lot of different forage varieties. And the big thing behind a forage variety is that it's designed to be growing more biomass, more leaf matter than soybeans itself. So we've been testing a lot of different varieties of soybeans, as well as a few other species this year. We started adding in some other kind of favorite food plot species that people use, like cowpeas, alfalfa, American joint veg, and lab. I want to try to throw those in and see might this be more preferred by deer. And this is last year's data, and we had cameras in each of these different varieties of soybeans, each different colors of different variety. And these were different replicates. So we repeated the same species like in different blocks in different parts of the field, because we all know deer come out of the field edge and they're always going to graze the edge first. So we have multiple replicates. So what you can see here, and it's kind of a lot of movement, but there's a lot of variation between the deer grazing in different replicates. And there's not like a clear winner in terms of deer are always at one of these varieties versus another. The one, when you sum this up into just combine them all, you have these large error bars, which means there's a lot of variation in the system. The highest one was this blue plot, and this wasn't soybeans. In terms of like deer activity going to different types of soybeans, this was actually a plot of cowpeas that actually failed. We had a lot of weed pressure. There was some cowpeas and they basically were outcompeted by weeds. It was a big weedy mess. And the deer were in there the most. So, and you see these huge error bars, which mean like statistically, if we replicated this out maybe 100 times, we'd start to see differences, but there's just not huge differences, just so much variation. Deer are coming in from the edge. It's just, they're gonna prefer that to anything in a soybean variety, as far as what I'm seeing in the data at this point. And this, I highlighted this because this is, yeah, they're out in this grassy, weedy mess and not even in the soybeans. So we want to look at biomass. And this is what I've really keyed in on that I think is key about forage soybeans, in terms of like, again, we're in that big picture of like trying to manipulate vegetation and habitat for deer to keep them out of your farm fields. These are two different varieties we had here. This is a conventional group 3, and this is one of our forage soybeans here. So it's noticeably taller. They're more, there's actually quite a bit more biomass on some of our varieties, but stay tuned. Here's our plots this summer, just to show you a picture of what we had. We actually clipped this year, we had 6 replicates, and we clipped a square meter plot out of each one to really get at biomass. We used a drone to actually measure the height of these little plots. This is like the yellower, the taller, the warmer the color, the taller the plants were. So you see our variety, big fellow, eagle seed variety here was a lot taller than the lab. The alfalfa was very slow taking off in terms of biomass. So were the cowpeas and American soy veg. But several of our big fellow and this pioneer conventional soybean in group 5 really did well. Here we are. This is about what a deer is. I think about 10 pounds of soybean. We cut the square meter out, and this is what it looks like when we're measuring them. So that's another picture of what a deer can eat in a day. But they put out a lot of biomass. So how did they all compare? This is all of them. I was just running through this tonight. So this is the bigger the bar is the more weight for a square meter that was growing. And so they're ordered in biggest to smallest. And these two actually were tied on the top 2. And this is Eagle Seed, the big fellow variety. It's marketed towards hunters for food plots. And they both produced about 4 kilograms, which is about 10 pounds, 8 point something pounds of biomass a square meter. So I highlighted, and then the sort of average biomass sort of declined from there. Now I put in conventional soybean varieties into our test to see, like, are they any different than forage soybeans? And that's why I've got these 2 circled here. I don't know if it's Zitavo, I don't know how to pronounce that name, but that variety was a conventional group 3.4, and this group 5.3 here. This conventional pioneer soybean put out on average the same amount of biomass as our Eagle Seed big fellow, which is really interesting because I've really started to key in. I don't see a lot of differences in terms of deer preferring a certain type of variety. Now they might a little bit, but they do eat. And so if you're producing more biomass in this buffer, then you're gonna like be feeding more deer out there. So I was actually really surprised to see how much biomass was coming from these conventional soybeans. The nice thing about conventional soybeans, and you guys probably all know this, first off, they yield better. Second off, they have more traits available for spraying herbicides. So this big fellow is only Roundup resistant, so you can't use some of your other herbicides if you have like marriage tail and other things like that. So yeah, big thing. You might be able to get away with using conventional soybeans for this approach as well. I would suggest sort of a mid group. We're finding like group 5 should be a pretty good maturity group to use. Okay, this is a little bit of an unexpected finding. Now, this is a graph showing our sort of deer spikes in blue. Those spikes in blue here is that same graph I showed earlier of like deer activity, where we had these several spikes about 10 days or a week apart. So it's just taking out the colors. Now, when I showed that graph to a corn club group of farmers, somebody asked, well, what's causing these spikes? It's like, I should check that against the weather. What I plotted here in red is our precipitation, the amount of inches of rain that we're falling during these times. And you can't see it super obviously here, but when we look at the big days that we're grazing, I started looking at the rainfall data about a day before and then 2 days before, and we have these rainfall events. And you start to see that it's not a super clear pattern, but right here, there was this rain. It was quite a dry spell for about 10 days, a week, 10 days. Then we had rain, and then this deer grazing really hit. And then it sort of let off, and then we had rain, and this spike hit. And we had rain, we had a little bit more hits. It's not a perfect predictor, but when we ran this through the statistical models, it's saying, yes, It does look like there are deer grazing about 2 days after a pretty significant rainfall event, which was interesting. And potentially something you could use and just know about and think about in terms of like the deer pressure, these spiking events can happen about 2 days after rain. And what I think is happening is those plants pull up all that moisture into the plant, high moisture content, it's putting on new growth, and it's just really palatable. So I think the deer at that point are more willing to come out and eat the garden fresh vegetables out in the field. So this is all the data, and it's like, okay, you haven't convinced me as it works. What do farmers say? We actually gave away forage soybeans to farmers to see what they thought. And we asked them, you know, how well do you think these different varieties of soybeans worked in terms of reducing your damage? And we got, on a scale of 1 to 10, we got farmers telling us about an 8, 6, 7, 8 out of 10 in terms of it working. So some people said 0, some people said 10. This is where the average came out from our farmer survey. Now, that's a lot of our research in terms of using forage soybean varieties in a buffer. One thing I think that you could think about if you have woods around your field that you own and you can manage, a lot of people don't think about managing their woods to keep the deer in the woods. So one thing you can do is something we call edge feathering, or even just forest management. If you do forest thinning and you are able to get more sunlight through that canopy down to the ground, that's going to grow shrubby vegetation on the ground level, deer will go and eat that. They want to be in the cover of the forest anyways. And so doing some forest management practices can be a really good tool to keep deer out of your fields entirely and not have to worry about affecting forage soybeans either. So another tool to think about in terms of vegetation and habitat manipulation to keep deer out of your fields. And I'm happy to answer any questions. So if anybody has questions along the way, just raise your hand. Yeah.
So how wide of a buffer are you talking about? Drilling or
Yeah. So the question was how big of a buffer are you talking about? I believe in this field it was 2 planter widths, and the farmer. This is my first year to study, so I'm getting a little bit old on this. I believe this is a single planter width, and he wanted to go ahead and do 2 planter widths in future years. Which, you know, you think about you are losing, you know, ground of your crops. So, but he thought that this would work, and this is an ag agent in Maryland, Jim Lewis, who's a experienced ag agent, who thought it was worth doing.
Are you increasing population in the 2 planter width to get more plants?
I think we're using pretty standard population counts to the planting populations, but you could double your population counts, things like that. That might help, especially in situations where they're going to get nipped off so bad like this. You know, you could also replant. You have time for that. So that's the sort of habitat and vegetation manipulation piece. So there's 4 pieces again. So that's one, and I just like to show all of these because each farmer has a unique situation that they can deal with, unique constraints, unique costs. So sometimes you can't shoot in an environment, you can't use fencing. This might be your only choice. So now we'll talk about fencing options. Cornell has a really great, this is oriented out of the Cornell Forestry Department. They have a really great publication on low cost fence designs. And this is a picture of what how their system works. So you can actually use existing trees. You can put blocks on them to protect your trees, to keep them from getting wires in them. And it's plastic mesh. And this works. It's about 8 feet tall, and it keeps deer out. It does require maintenance. They do get holes in them. Deer can plow through them, but it can be pretty effective in some cases. This is sort of a low cost approach. You can also go put in more high cost fence. This is around a vineyard in Calvert County, Maryland, where I live. And you can see this is a pretty serious endeavor. This is quite expensive to put up. There's quite a bit of maintenance costs involved with this too, especially if you have trees along the edge where tree limbs fall, break your fence down, you have to go repair it. We at our research farm, we use electric fences as well, permanent electric fences. This is just I think 4 or 5 wires going across like this that work as well for some of our orchard species and other things to keep deer out. I like to think about like gate considerations, like how to get in and out of a fenced area, because sometimes that can be a real problem. You want to make sure you have wide gates to get your equipment in and out of. This is a little bit hard to see, but this is actually two spring loaded just bars, and they have electric, there's wires hanging down here that are electrified as well. So this actually keeps the deer out well enough, and you can sort of pull these back. You can drive through it as well, they're just sort of spring loaded. But you can also pull these back and go in and out more easily than having to open some big fence. The guys, we have call this Fort Knox. This is where we like do all our really important research where we can't have deer grazing messing up the results. And you can actually develop a cattle guard and a very wide cattle guard as well to keep deer out of the fenced area. If this is something you want to do, if you have a smaller acreage sort of situation or you have high value crops, this is something you need to think about as well. This I think is probably the cheapest thing you can do. And this is just single strand electric fence. This is a poly tape electric fence. These are $3 electric fence step-in stakes. This works pretty well for keeping deer out. Obviously, they can get through this from time to time. The trick with using something like this is to bait it and to get those deer trained on it. If they're not trained, they don't know what it is. They walk into it, they get shocked, they freak out, they run right through it, and they break it down, and they're grazing in your fields all night. What you do is you bait it, you train them on it, and there's a lot of people will use like aluminum tabs with like peanut butter. And our farm manager has a really cool little tip. He just uses molasses. He gets a bucket of molasses and he puts on a rubber glove and he just goes along it and he just wipes molasses on this tape every 100 feet or so. And those deer come up, they lick that molasses and they get a little zap and they're like, I'm not going anywhere near that thing. So that works pretty well. And it's cheap. This is the cheapest thing you can do. If you want to go, yeah, go ahead.
Did you, or have you, or does anybody else, how long do you need to have that electric fence up? I mean, do you have to have it up for growing season? Can you put it up for 60 days and then take it down? What
Yeah.
training deer, and obviously the soybean once they get so big, you know,
Yeah.
you really don't forage on it.
Yeah. So the question is, how long do you have to have this up during the growing season? And I would say it kind of depends, of course. That's like a favorite PhD answer to anything. It depends. Sorry, but I think that certainly those early, I would say from planting until these plants are getting about 2 feet tall, and then at that point, I found soybeans can outgrow the deer. The deer don't want to go in it, and there's just too much biomass out there for the deer to be able to eat. Actually, we've seen some results like moderate deer grazing at that level actually can maybe even help slightly in yields because you get this branching effect on the soybeans. So like I would say up until those soybeans are quite mature and can sort of outgrow that. So that's probably getting you into July. You could probably get away with it if you planted June. You could probably get away with it maybe as a minimum of 6 weeks, maybe longer is probably better. So that's something in terms of maintenance for this. I've met a farmer who uses this, and he has a guy who it's a pretty large farm, puts him on a gator every day and he checks the fences every day. Now he has low labor costs and he has a guy who can do that. So if you have that, if you have a young guy you can send out and check every day, that can work for you, and then they fix it if it's down. But again, there's so many different constraints for different people.
Yeah, back on when you had the deer grazing events and weather, planting earlier doesn't, like your energy curve was showing that your grazing was later. Planting earlier, does that get you enough advantage there?
I don't think you could plant. That's an interesting question. There's probably trade-offs in terms. So the question is, can you plant earlier to get those soybeans growing more to sort of like get that biomass growing before the deer really hit their peaks? I would say you probably start running into other problems with like potential frost or like cold spells that could damage your soybean yields as well. I'm not totally familiar with the sort of disadvantages of planting real early, but you probably start to get other sort of negative impacts just from environmentally from planting too early. And I think still those plants when they first come out, there's just not enough biomass in those seedlings. That's probably when if you can protect them for the first like 3 weeks even, that's probably would do you huge amounts of good, because I think a lot of that damage happens the first 3 weeks when you have the cotyledon And that first trifoliate, if the deer will come and eat below the cotyledon, it kills the plant entirely. If they get above the cotyledon and take off that first trifoliate, it'll grow back. And a lot of times, if there's not another real heavy deer pressure, it can do fine. So they're very resilient. But that's sort of like that first seedling stage, which is really bad.
Deer density, and I realize that you've got 40 acre field and 1,000 acres of woods, you've got lots of deer density on that 40 acre field. But are you talking 20 deer square mile or 200 deer square mile?
I don't like to use deer density estimates like that because I find it's very hard because like deer moving across the landscape and it's like, well, where do you call your boundaries? And so they move off that boundary, density is still the same. But I would say that situation is probably more in like the 40 to 60 deer per square mile range. So it's pretty high densities. He's not able to manage that whole forest population.
What's
Yeah, go
the
ahead.
planting date? Are they double crop beans or? I'm just curious.
No, these were regular. We've had different planting dates on our 3 years. Some years we get them in early, some years we get them in a little bit later. So I'd say like early June, mid-June, I believe is when we're getting them in. I think, yeah, sorry.
I just didn't know if they were after wheat down here.
No, these are, we're putting them in, yeah. But that's an interesting question. I don't know how that might work in terms of, timing.
Have you guys tried planting the buffer bean earlier? Where they're like.
Yeah, that was sort of related to this question over here. Yeah, I think you could try to do that, but the problem is like you could have like soybeans sitting in the soil and they don't germinate, and I think there's some like rotting issues or germination problems that can happen if you plant too early. That is what my farmers are telling me. So, so you could try it, but you start to have potential risks of other problems cropping up. Yeah.
You ever have really in-depth conversations with the game commission about overpopulation of deer, less hunting going on? You're only allowed to take so many deer a year, where it costs you more money to take them. The time, what do you do with the deer? Like there's such an overpopulation of deer right now, at least in my area, in eastern Pennsylvania. And there's no clear way to get rid of them other than depopulate them on a bigger scale.
Yeah.
But obviously people frown upon that. And then, as a hunter, you don't want to waste meat, but it's really the real answer is you have to depopulate. So is anybody talking to game commissions on that kind of scale about it?
Yeah, and we're gonna get to lethal control here in a second. I think there's gonna be a Pennsylvania Game Commission representative here today. Is that happening? Maybe not, maybe it's me. We'll get this for the lethal control, because this happened a lot. We have, our DNR is actually really good. They show up with the Farm Bureau, they meet with them. They try to craft legislation to make things easier. We'll get to that here when I hit lethal control. So let's zoom ahead to that. So these are our fencing options. I was showing this one. There's a good publication on, you can also use double electric fences in certain situations. You use more space in your fields. This is actually really effective. What happens is the deer have very poor depth perception. So they only have like kind of one, like they can't see 3 dimensions very well on the side of their head. So the sort of like extra layer on the outside throws them off, and they can't quite tell how far they need to jump to get over the fence. A little bit more expensive, a lot more time consuming to put something like this up, but there's a good publication out of Clemson that gives you all the details how to do something like this. So if you don't want the simple 1 strand or 2 strand electric fence, which I've seen work really effectively. I've seen soybeans grow up really well with even 2 strands of electric polytape fence. But if you really want something effective, this is awesome. Another tool, another idea in your toolbox. Tree tubes, if any of you are growing orchards or trees or anything like that, tree tubes are key, or you're trying to replant oaks and things like that. I just put this in the fencing section just to note this is another thing to think about. You can also have like wire exclusion cages as well. Okay, repellents, and then we're going to get to lethal control, because I think that is a big piece of this thing. So repellents, I was not sure repellents were actually a feasible option. But the Delaware Soybean Board was interested in looking at this, and I had a farmer, and that same farmer was like, let's try repellents this year, because we actually planted this whole field in forage soybeans. The deer ate it all down. I was like, okay, let's try some repellents. So we've been hearing about Desex, which is an insecticidal soap that you can use. It's actually this is the least expensive of these 3. We used Hinder and Plant Skid. We researched about 10 of these and found which ones are the most affordable. Because it's not practical. It's going to cost $60 per acre per application. You have to apply it 3 times. It's just not going to make sense. But these were all about between $20 and $30 per acre per application. And funded by the Delaware Soybean Board. There's some disadvantages to repellents. Obviously, if you reapply and rain can cause problems. But here's this farmer. This is that same farmer who did this. I like to just open this with the economic case study of like how much he lost on his field. Basically, we had these exposures that you saw, and we calculated the yield in those exposures per square foot, and then we sort of calculated what his actual yield in the whole thing was. The big picture that I want to draw everybody to, he had about 66% yield loss on his fields. So, and that was calculated up if you assume just gross numbers. We were using the number of 12.50 price per bushel of soybeans. I was estimating a loss of about $370 per acre he was losing. So that's sort of our baseline of like, this is gross, granted there's a lot of other costs that come in, but this is like total yield. So how much does this stuff cost if you're going to do these repellents? Because we want to make sure that these are affordable and cost effective. These are approximate amounts of price per acre per application for each of these. So $20 for the Desex, and the most expensive was Plant Skid, 28, Hinder was 24. He used an air blast sprayer to spray these repellents around the edge of his field, and this, you can see the sort of mist moving across his field. It's a fun toy, it's pretty cool. Be out there and spraying this thing. And this is a soybean field this year. I was pretty surprised. The deer were gone for like a week after we sprayed this stuff. There were some challenges. Mother Nature doesn't cooperate, so it rained right after one of those events, or it's too wet to get back out. So there's stuff that is problematic with this, but he's got a soybean crop this year. So here's an example of what that same deer exposure. We had those exposures out. Here's one of those exposures. You can barely see an outline of a fence right there. That's one of our exposures. So the soybeans are growing pretty well. This is where it was before. That's that picture at the beginning of the scene I showed you. So repellents seem to be working. They certainly have a cost. Here's what they, is it worth it? $370 per acre loss. That was his baseline losses. He had to treat 3 times, and each one was $20 to almost $30 an acre. So he's looking at $60 to $84 per acre in chemical. That's the spray. That's just the chemical alone. He had labor costs and his capital costs. So again, if you have an air blast sprayer, you want to do this, you have time, and this is something you want to try out, and you're not valuing this at a really high amount, it could make sense, because your chemical cost alone is only $60 to $84, and you've lost almost $400 of yield. So it's feasible if you want to go through all that and try that out. Okay, lethal control, favorite one. Somebody told me once their favorite type of deer repellent was lead. So yeah, question back here. Yeah, that's essentially how he did this. We tried 3 different ones, and we're waiting to get the yield monitor data when this gets harvested. But this section back here was I think Plant Skid. This section here was Desex. There was another section over to the right off the picture that was Hinder. He actually pretty much just sprayed from the perimeter here. And that air blast sprayer was reaching out about 150 feet out into the field, maybe 200 even feet out. So yeah, there's pretty much a buffer outside edge application for this. So, and it kept them out. We were worried, yeah, they're just going to go to the middle, and we put exposures out in the middle, and they didn't. So now he does have a small field in the back that's like 4 acres, and he has a little bit of soybeans there, but which is 4 soybeans, there were no soybeans left. And they broke down the excluded fences and ate inside the excluded fences. They were that hungry. But he's got a little bit of soybeans there, but so they work better, I think, than forest soybeans.
Is it the scent of it? Because you figure that the deer start eating soybeans, but they're only about, putting out their first kind of full of it. So you need leaf coverage, or is it the scent of the product that's working better?
Yeah, there's different approaches to what's being used. Insecticidal soap, I think, is also a taste repellent. So like if you imagine taste soap is gross. The Plant Skid is like a blood-based repellent. It was kind of hard to apply. I don't know if I really recommend it. There was like mixing, and it was kind of gross. It was red. I kind of wondered if like this is not like good for you to be around this powdery blood stuff. But so So yeah, there's different types. Some they call that like a fear. There's probably some smell in the blood they don't want to be around. So
Have you tried biosolids pellets?
yes, we didn't use that here. I have my colleague has tried those for years, a few years, and I think he said that he found they just jumped across it and then went into the middle. I think they could work. I haven't tried them myself. I don't have firsthand experience with them, but they could be a potential option.
There's a number of farmers down in my area trying to use them. I know the supplies for the field. They don't like the smell.
Yeah. So the question was, are biosolids being used? And he says there's some farmers who are using it with some success. So it's another question.
So I've been told I'm insane by many people. I don't think I am. In my experience, the best chemical for deer prevention is the mirrorless line of fungicides. Like you can, when we spray heat with mirrorless Ace, we always just spring the corners, we go back into the corners. And the deer will go and eat the heads off and eat right before the sprayer.
Oh, wow.
And that kind of gives me my idea to go with them. You know, usually when you're spraying fungicide on something, they always don't have like tremendous deer pressure. There's no sense in wasting a fungicide. But I started spraying some field fungicide, and a lot of the farms around our area are strips, and immediately after you spray, there's no deer in the soybeans, it was all in the corn. You know, but at that point, people later in the season, I'd rather have the deer in the corn because there's a ton there for them to eat, and they can't do, you know, basically the ton of damage if they can't soybean. And I've tried the deer repellents. I've had Explode, I've had the Norris hot sauce, I've had the plant skin, and if you have deer, like hungry deer, you just go the way. And
Interesting. So what was the name of the fungicide?
mirror this.
Mirrorless fungicide. So it very well could work. I mean, Desex is actually an insecticidal soap. So the nice thing about Desex is you can apply it with like regular boom sprayers and it's part of your herbicide or whatever regimen.
My experience in nervous is it works better than the actual repellents, and it's in that, you know,
That's
say
cool.
$22 an acre range. Well,
Yeah.
here you can sell it on the perspective, you know, yourself. You're actually getting a fungicide, which is gonna pay for itself regardless.
Right.
And you're getting deer control out of it.
Yeah.
Versus, you know, some magical deer repellent that is gonna wash off.
Yep. Yeah.
You didn't get any actual plant benefit.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. So there might be some benefits. I've not, as first I heard it, I love hearing that stuff because like Desex is something we heard from farmers too, this insecticidal soap. It was, I think, also providing benefits from insect damage on these soybeans too. So it very well could be something repellent in that fungicide. So people are interested in trying new things. And what's the cost? Do you have some, is it in that same line of? So something, it's in that same range. So if you're gonna apply fungicide anyways, then yeah, you could build that in your system. I think Desex is the other one I would recommend. If I was a farmer, I'd be looking at things that are gonna already help your crop for something else. And then you also sort of get this side to your benefit. So cool. Thanks for sharing. Okay, lethal. So you can use recreational hunting. I know Pennsylvania has increased, Maryland has very liberal antlerless harvest limits. You can take 15 deer a year with archery, you can take 15 with gun and 10 with black powder. You could, if you're really good, you could somehow take like 35 or 40 deer with just a regular hunting license. Here, I think it's 6 does, I think you can get. In your hunting license, you might be able to get more. So they've increased the antlerless limit. That's key to hunting. And you have this ag tag program here in Pennsylvania. I'm not super familiar with it. It used to be called the red tag program, but I did some reading up on it last night. So the keys to lethal control is you got to get your females out of there. They're the ones that are driving your population growth. If you're only hunting bucks, you're doing just about nothing for your deer population control. One buck can service 50 does. So if you leave one duck, if you leave all your does, their population's going to really go. So there's some different techniques. How many people here are hunters? There's quite a few, so you guys are pretty familiar with it, but there's some little techniques that I think are helpful to think about. One thing is if you have people out every day in the woods, deer become educated. Actually, professional deer removal folks do not want hunters hunting on a population if they're going to do deer control and trying to take out a lot of animals because they become smart, they become nocturnal. They want to come in one day from like kind of naive deer and knock out as many as they can in one day. So you can try to replicate that in a hunting program where you just have everybody is gonna hunt on one day, and then we're gonna back off for 3 weeks. And everybody goes and hunts for one day, and we have 10 people in the woods and we shoot as many as we can. You bump deer around because of that, so you have deer can't really escape as much. So I think that's one approach to really try to get your numbers through a hunting program up. There are opportunities to get multiple shots on a deer. If you have a group of does, if you can, there are harvest techniques, especially if you're using a rifle, which I think you can't hear in most cases, to shoot them in a location where they will drop immediately and not run. And if you're a good shot and you can do that, you can actually they won't run away, and you can take out the whole group all at once. So that's another technique that there's YouTube videos on how to do it. It's called a high shoulder shot. And they will just drop down to the ground. If they don't run and that tail doesn't go up, then all the other deer sort of look around like lightning went off, and they'll sort of walk. There's some more good examples I can give, but I'll refrain. But I've had deer to sort of walk up to the one that's dead on the ground and just sort of sniffing, like wondering what's going on. So like you can do that. So these are sort of techniques if you really need to reduce your populations, you can do. Elevated stands are really important. Get your scent out of the ground, scent control. And there are like incentives I've seen landowners do to try to incentivize their hunters to get more antlerless deer out. A lot of times they're dealing with hunters that want to come and get a buck. And so you have to either earn a buck, you have to shoot 2 does before you can shoot a buck. These are sort of internal hunting club rules, or some have done incentives for getting does harvested. So they'll have like a little competition. They'll say like, whoever gets the heaviest doe this year, they get like free access to the cooler. They can use this like freezer of mine, where they get this special XYZ. So there are model lease agreements where you kind of build that stuff into your agreement. And I think one of the really important things for these incentives and things is to like enforce them, and like kick a hunter out of the hunting lease and all of a sudden everybody like starts shaking up, said yes. So that's something that I've seen, like it was shocking they got kicked out of the hunting lease and they're like, no, this is for real. So, okay.
So let's back up.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's great to go out in archery season with 20 parade harvest and shoot does, but that doesn't really, I mean, you need to kill deer either early, kill fawns, you know, let's open that can of worms up. So, you know, what about if we had new permits or some combination? Should we be killing fawns? Should we be killing does with fawns?
Yeah, so
What can you share?
yeah, so like hunting does, even in the fall during hunting season, it will reduce the population because they're not going to be getting bred for the following year. So you still are going to be reducing that population. I have heard from a farmer who's in Maryland, we can hunt with crop damage permits year round. Here, I think your limits are April 15th, I think is what I saw. You might have other options to hunt, to shoot, I think with special permits or permission. But I had a farmer tell me, he said he was hunting on a field and he says, it was when we started shooting the fawns that all the deer took off. Like they didn't come back once we shot fawns. He said, it sounds bad, but we shot the fawns and those didn't come back. He learned really quick. So they had shot several does, and then when they hit fawns, something that he noticed that he thought helped. I think if I was a farmer and I was serious about it, I really didn't want to deal with this anymore. It's a lot of time in the field, a lot of effort goes into that. So if you can do it legally as part of your process, then I would say, want to reduce your deer damage, reducing the deer numbers helps less mouths to be able to feed. So, yeah. So, did that answer your question?
Yeah. Well, I just, you know,
Yeah.
you got farmers that are at that stage.
Yeah, I know some people are also like are really uncomfortable shooting does that are pregnant or about to give birth. They clean them out and see fetuses drop out, and that's kind of disturbs some people. But you know, this is sort of trade-offs to deal with. How many people here would never shoot a fawn? Show of hands. Just can't do it. Can't do it. It's all right. Yeah, it's like nobody's gonna admit to any of this stuff, right? I'm recording this for myself. I'm like, this is not gonna go up on YouTube. This is not gonna work.
I guess the amount of money that's lost every year in deer, and the amount of money that's put into grants for stuff like this to find out. Why can we breed plants that change color, bloom when we want to? Why can't they breed a soybean? Are we not putting money into that program and breed a soybean that tastes better? You know, why, like, do you work with any breeders or people that work with genetics, like, they would ground up ready crops? Are they working on that?
I think so. It's a very challenging thing to figure out. I've not been able to see that deer prefer one soybean versus another. Now, I think they do. But like in our studies, they're in one field and the fields are small enough that deer, they're gonna eat a soybean this or that. I mean, I do think the big fellows, they look tastier, there's smaller hairs on them. I think they're more palatable. Anecdotally, I feel like they're grazing them more, but in my deer camera data, I'm not seeing it. Now, it's really hard to measure like deer damage on like 50 plants, you know, so it's really challenging. I think there probably are some slight differences in preferences, and there probably are breeding tools you can use. I think hairs, there's all sorts of like components, there's anti-nutritional factors you could probably select for on these things. So my challenges has been like figuring out, I guess if you had a captive deer, well, okay, so you had a captive deer population, you could like do like a cafeteria study sort of thing. It's really hard because like there's variation between like deer have personalities about what they want to eat too. And so like some areas like they won't eat turnips. In some places like farms plant them for food plots and like love the turnips. So there's like these sort of learned eating behaviors too. So I think that also complicates it too and makes it really hard to say like this soybean they're not going to eat because like you have just these personalities and like deer just won't eat a food plot that's planted for them just because they haven't learned that it's food yet. Or there's just like taste variation between individual animals.
Do you know any companies actively working on genetics with soybeans to change the taste?
I would say most of them are oriented towards like making them more palatable in the forage soybeans for hunting. I'm not familiar with anybody working to actively make them like less palatable, but there could be somebody out there doing that. Yeah.
I think if you make the bean not palatable to deer, you're also gonna make it not palatable to cow or the chicken or the pig is gonna be the end user anyway. I think that's gonna be the issue.
Well, there's also a difference between the leaves and the pods and the soybeans themselves. So like if you get the leaves that are not palatable, then the beans might not be affected. I did some research on this, like that actually the beans themselves have several anti-nutritional factors in them, they call them ANFs, that make them, my understanding is that they need to be steamed before they can be fed to livestock because they can sort of build up and reduce weight gain in chickens and things like that. So there are probably, I've dug into that a bit, but I don't know anybody actively. Those same anti-nutritional factors in soybeans are not commonly found in the leaf in high concentrations. We could probably try, there are probably opportunities to do something like that, so.
Just a couple observations, there are forage crops, some here don't for heat. So forage sorghum and a few others, here will go someplace else in that place. The other thing in row crop corn, if you kind of lattice the outside rows, deer will avoid that to like block their heat rows. So if you kind of create a natural maze on the outside, like and that field size, we'll try to avoid that, like, you know, walking through that maze.
Yeah.
In beans, you know, the struggle is you've got a whole field growing with the same growth rate, and of course you want to feed on it. But did you look at planting anything besides beans around the outside of the field?
I started this year, I tried to plant something called forage corn, which I've heard also deer love. It produces a pretty good amount of biomass. Those plots, the germination rate was really low on them. There was additional crops, like a small tornado came down and kind of wiped out the plots. So like, it wasn't like at one of my primary study sites. So it's possible, but we're trying to play with some of that stuff, but don't have good, I think it could work. I think if you know something that you've planted for food plots or as a forage corn, I've heard that from some people that deer just like destroy forage corn, or also silage varieties of corn as well seem to be more palatable to deer. And I've heard farmers tell me that they made the mistake once of planting silage corn or certain varieties of corn and they got destroyed. So I think silage corn particularly has some preferential sort of forage components to it. So you could probably use that instead of forage soybeans too. Okay, let's wrap this thing up. But happy to take more questions. So I have this last slide. I have these two arrows from like habitat and vegetation and repellents here, both pointing back to lethal control, because I want to really emphasize, like, if you're doing all these forage soybeans, you're planting all this food for deer, you're giving them nutrition so they can have more babies and reproduce, and then soon they will sort of grow up to fulfill that need, and then they'll start moving into your crops again. So you need to really match that with lethal control to keep your densities down. Same thing with repellents. If you have too high densities or your field is too small, there's probably nothing you can do. If the deer are starving, they will just hold their nose and eat rather than starve to death. So, so I always like have these two, make sure to tie in these components, so lethal control piece. Fencing, of course, you just sort of fence them out and like let other people deal with it on the outside. There are sort of ecological and aesthetic sort of disadvantages to fencing, so something to think about. Same thing with electric fences. Sometimes you can have wildlife. Just want to say, like, you know, turtles come up and clamp down, bite the lower wire, and then get fried, and other animals like that. So if you want to sort of think about that, those sort of disadvantages to fencing too. So, okay, that's it. That wraps it up. Happy to take some more questions and discussion. I want to make sure I thank the Maryland Soybean Board and Delaware Soybean Board. They've both been super generous in funding this over the last 3 years. If you have any questions, here's my email. I'm on X and Twitter. Give me a follow if you're on X. If anybody who uses X, I didn't use it for the longest time. It's actually kind of fun. I've been enjoying it. I'll watch for your follow. I'll follow you back. This is where you can give me feedback, like what you liked. My supervisors, a lot of evaluation stuff. So if you take a picture of this with your phone, it'll take you to a link, give me an evaluation, tell me what you'd like more of, or what different stuff you'd like to hear about. And happy to take some more questions and discussion. Yeah.
Is there any research drones that chase deer out of the field?
So the question was whether you can use drones to chase deer out of field, and anybody's using that. The problem with drones is currently legally you need to have direct line of sight on the drone. You could probably do it. I think we saw like they come at 2 in the morning. You have to actually be operating. Somebody said, "Oh, that might work if you could time it. You know, just set it to go, program it to go out and like sort of fly the fields." I think that doesn't. You know, currently under legal, what we have now is you have to actually be out there watching it. So labor cost of doing that would be probably a problem. Even if you could program it, deer, I think, would quickly kind of acclimate to it. I think the first few times they probably freak out and run out of the field, but eventually, after you do it 10, 15 times, you're like, oh.
And is there anything that the guys that are dealing with wild hogs, is there anything that we can learn from the hog problems in the south that we can apply to deer?
Yeah, if you can shoot deer at night with thermal scopes, that's a very efficient way to remove and depopulate deer populations. I think that's the most efficient way to do it. If you can, yeah, I mean, Maryland has the option to do, they call it deer cooperator permits. You can hunt them at night or shoot them at night, because it's not really hunting at that point. But there are programs to do it. It's just like to get it through the legislature, you're dealing with sort of PR issues. We're actually running a landowner survey right now in Maryland, and we are asking them the question. We sort of lay out the scenario. We have high deer densities. Are you okay with night hunting? And we also asking them, are you okay with markets for venison, for people selling venison? These are controversial issues. People have strong opinions on them, but I was very curious to hear. And I'm actually surprised our results for markets for venison are about, I think maybe majority of people are okay with markets. So if you had a value to venison and you could, all these deer you're shooting, you send stuff, give to the butcher and they pay you a little bit of money for it, I think that would change things. And also night shooting. So, but when our Farm Bureau brings that up to the, you know, when their Farm Bureau is talking to DNR, they're like, you can try this, but sometimes like it sort of galvanizes other interest groups to say, no way, and then you can sometimes lose, because there's some fear you can lose your rights to hunt at night if you bring this up again and you don't have your PR machine working, and other lobbying groups get involved and can take it lose the program entirely. So we've had that's that sort of delicate dance in terms of like how you get legislature passed. So yeah.
Yeah, I was in the company that developed for the DNR side, and we signed the deer to get that. And they just smell stuff. They would walk around our field to get that DNR. So when first DNR children came out in 1997, I got a phone call. I wanted to show them. We tried everything else, and they were from that store. So we started putting it around other fields, they've been into this guessing that servants and MDMR, that's also versus everything else we tried.
And BMR is brown mid-rib corn, I believe, and that's a forage corn and it's tough, different than forage corn.
Yeah.
Okay. So he's talking about how there's also brown mid-rib sorghum that you can also use a deer are preferring. Yeah, somebody emailed me, I don't know if that person's here, but they actually, no, they're not, but they told me how they're having. Some people will just plant sorghum because deer won't eat sorghum. I think conventional sorghum, so some farmers have just shifted to planting sorghum and like high deer density problem. Yeah, so okay, if you want to attract them, use BMR sorghum. You don't use conventional stuff.
Luke, I've heard anecdotal remarks that red lasers are disorienting to nighttime vision for deer.
Yeah.
Is that true? And is that a potential? Is there any potential there?
The question was about red lasers to get deer out of the fields. I've heard that for vultures, like we have black vultures in people's houses, they use lasers for that. I think it does get them out of the fields. I can see it maybe get them out of fields. But again, like somebody has to be operating that laser at the time when the deer in the field. So you got that sort of like, they can get up at 3 AM when they're out. Like,
Right, you have to permanently.
Yeah, you just
Set up a bunch of them.
at that point, you might as well be hunting, and then they're done. So they're gonna come right back when you stop lasering. Yeah, there you go, laser on the gun, laser sight on the gun. Cool. Any other way, go ahead.
We use something like that, it usually works for a period of time. So they learn what they are, so you can move them pretty fast.
Using lasers or?
It's like I don't know if it's a laser, but it's a red light.
Okay, like fox lights maybe, oh, interesting, yeah, so there are tools being used for like wolves, yeah.
For a bit.
Yeah, like for wolves, and they call them fox lights, they're just you can hang out and they put them randomly, like make sound and flash lights. If you're in a place where you can't shoot, some people are like a middle of a subdivision, like, and have no other choice, could be something to try. I've not experimented with that yet, but are you guys having, is it working for you guys?
Well, like I said, sometimes it works well, and if you move them somewhat regularly,
Yeah, so the importance is moving them around and keeping those deer from acclimating to them. I've also heard people just putting women's perfume on a shirt and hanging up on a scarecrow, like adding human scent into the environment in an unusual way can also maybe keep them back. But it's probably the type of thing you have to go back and move and keep switching up, which is the same thing they find with these fox lights for wolves. They have flags that kind of distract wolves. It's like it works for a while, so you have to always like kind of shift over something. So you're using some visual thing, and then you shift over some sound thing. I mean, people use like sprayers, like garden sprayers that go out at random times of the night. So you have to kind of constantly change to keep them from acclimating down. Well, yeah.
I've heard some orchard growers using dogs.
Yeah, dogs I think can work. They're relatively low acreage. I think for I think the estimates are like 20 to 30 acres is what a pair of dogs can handle. So dogs as a repellent. The thing that you need to make sure you have is it works best in like flat areas if there's topography. Then deer can come in on those low spots and the dogs can't smell them. So that kind of makes your acreage smaller if you have hills. The other thing with dogs is you have to have them out at night. So they need to be out patrolling, but then if they're coming in at night and hanging out with family, they're not doing their job. So they have to be out and doing that. So. Cool. Any other questions? Been really learned some great tips. I love the thing about